The number one selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
This episode is brought to you by Lifelock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
A reason to buy jewelry? You don't need one. Gift yourself the modern classic piece you've always had your eye on at BlueNile.com. Blue Nile's collection of high-quality diamond jewelry is ready to complement your every look. Show off your elegant taste with a pair of diamond studs, or serve up brilliant style in a traditional tennis bracelet, shipped right to your door. Reward yourself with a piece you've always wanted at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com.
The Athletic.
We ask how Ferrari got it so wrong in China that both its cars got disqualified, attempt to measure McLaren's advantage, and answer your questions on underbody airflow, slot gaps in the front wing, and downforce levels. Welcome to another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show. We've got loads to talk about today, given we've had 2 whole race weekends of the 2025 F1 season. We've learned a huge amount there and lots of talking points. I'm Edd Straw, but far more important, of course, is the legend that is Gary Anderson. How have you enjoyed the past couple of weeks, Gary? We've learnt a lot. Good to get the season started.
Yeah, it is good to get the season started. Obviously, just prior to China, it was all a bit dismal with the passing of Eddie Jordan, my good old colleague and workmate, and whatever you like to call him. But life must go on, as they say. So, yeah, getting the first 2 races over and done with was, hopefully we get a guideline from it as to where everybody was. And I think we have. It's obviously that one of those sort of situations where there's quite a few teams have got a lot of work to do. With McLaren coming away with 2 wins out of 2 races and 2 pole positions, both very different circuits, both very different conditions. It shows that they do have a car for, as I say, all occasions. Don't think it's just a cruise in the park for them as far as driving the car is concerned. I think it is quite difficult, and we've seen both drivers making mistakes. But it's it'll take a few more races to see how stable they can come to terms with that car and how the other ones approach closing up that gap.
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting sample of a couple of weekends where we've seen different strengths and weaknesses of different cars. Now, I think the obvious talking point for the first part of the podcast, it's normally a free choice for you, but I think it's such an obvious one, isn't it? The double Ferrari disqualification was extraordinary, doubly so given that it was actually 2 different offences. Charles Leclerc was underweight, Lewis Hamilton was for plank wear. How does this happen, Gary? This seems extraordinary for a Grand Prix team in this day and age to get that wrong. Do you have any sympathy for them?
No, not really. I don't think so. It's the same for everybody. There's a set of regulations that you have to comply to. And if we just take the first one, the weight penalty, the weight disqualification for Leclerc, it's one of those things where, yes, everybody's trying to run on the borderline because the weight of the car is critically important to lap time. But we're talking here, 10 kilograms on an average circuit is 0.3 of a second. So, 1 or 2 kilograms is 0.03 or 0.06 tenths of a second per lap. So it's always going to be a deficit, but in reality, it's probably within the grey area of the consistency of the driver. And, at the end of the day, if you put all your eggs in the basket and end up critical on that situation, on the weight, then you have to pay the price. Yes, they went from doing a one-stop to from doing a potential two-stop to a one-stop race. So the tyres did go further, and for sure, they weighed less at the end of the race than they would have done if you'd done a two-stop race. But it all mounts up. No, it's not just that one thing that tipped them overboard. It's a load of little things. Playing the game too close to the mark will always put you at risk, especially where the weight's concerned. So, the cars all get weighed, and obviously there was a bit of damage to Leclerc's car, the front wing end plate, which, was a bit confusing because he was actually faster than Hamilton with it. But forget all that sort of stuff. They do weigh the car with a replacement nose assembly on it that's within a sort of small margin. So at the end of the day, they put themselves too close to the mark with it. And it's one of those sort of situations where, you do pay the price. So I don't have any sympathy for them on that, because I think you have to stay away from the borderline by enough, because these races are going to turn out to be a bit of a battle. And at the minute, I think it's so early in the season that, we don't really know what's going to happen, reliability-wise as well as a competitive level. So you have to make sure that you're there at the end of the race, doing the best job you can, and not risking getting thrown out because of it. Now, if we go to Lewis's problem with the thickness of the plank, again, sprint weekend, it does make it more difficult to get on top of the ride height of the car and make sure that the car is not hitting the ground too hard. You don't have all the running in practice. You don't have a sort of black and white long run to sort of analyse the plank wear. But you do have the sprint race. Okay, the fuel load's a third of what you carry in the main race. But, it's one of these sort of situations where if you're against the wall as far as learning about the plank wear, then perhaps you should start a millimetre higher, or a millimetre high rather than a millimetre low, and then, drop the car rather than raising the car. I think Ferrari paid a price for that in Australia, from having the car too high, or they seemed to raise it from the Friday, and lost a lot of performance. So they're probably a bit weary of that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, again, if Lewis did win the sprint race, so they had a car that was competitive for those, whatever it was, 19 laps or whatever the sprint race was. I don't really understand what happened to them for the qualifying for the main race and then the main event itself, because they were not the same car as Lewis drove on the Saturday in the sprint race for sure. So it's one of those sort of situations. They're going to have to look at themselves quite carefully and see where that performance comes and goes. Say Friday in Melbourne, Friday to Saturday, and then Sunday as well. They didn't look like the same car. And once again, in China, they had a car whenever the sprint race started, or qualifying for the sprint race and the sprint race, that was potentially, everybody would have said, yeah, that's pretty good. But they didn't make any ground whatsoever for qualifying for the main event. You've one set of soft tyres for the sprint race qualifying, so you've got to put all your eggs in that one basket. So you can't really take too many risks. Whereas for the main race event, you've got 3 sets of soft tyres during the 3 sessions at least. And actually, you end up with 4 because you normally use 2 in the final stint. So you'd think that the team and the driver would find a few tenths of a second, but actually Lewis was a tenth of a second slower than he was in the sprint qualifying. So for sure, their simulation work or their setup improvement or whatever it is that takes them from one day to the next is questionable. And so plank wear is something, again, it's black and white. You're allowed to wear a millimetre off the plank. It starts off life at 10 millimetres thick, and there's certain areas they measure. And if it gets down to less than 9, you're in trouble. And that's what happened. So I think there's a bit of negligence in there somewhere. But my biggest worry for them in reality would be their ability to to improve the car over a given weekend. We haven't seen that yet from them. So that's one of the areas where I think they should be having the fairly deep, in-depth conversations, I think, back in Maranello.
Well, I have to say, having watched that Ferrari extensively in Bahrain, then across a couple of sessions trackside in Australia and then a couple of sessions trackside in China, it looks to me like quite a capricious car in that there'll be little spells where you think, oh, this is looking quite good, but then other times it's just doing things. You know, when you just a car just is doing a little bit too much, and it seems to kind of go back and forth, and they try to shrug this off as, doing setup experiments, this kind of thing, but it doesn't look like one that just gets into a nice window and stays there, which is quite worrying for Ferrari.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I mean, I've only been watching it on TV, but I'd say that it sort of lacks rhythm, I think is the best way of putting it. You know, it's okay, it's fine, and then just one end or the other would just wash out or give up. And I'm not sure the drivers are doing that much differently. It's one of those sort of situations where, as you say, it just suddenly doesn't respond anymore. Just when it breaks into a bit of an understeer, it breaks into a lot of an understeer, or when the rear snaps, it does snap. So, yeah, I think it's a rhythm thing that's missing there. There's definitely somewhere where the car is quite critical to its aerodynamic stability, I suppose. And it really is down to the aerodynamic stability. But it doesn't seem to be giving the driver the feedback that he's getting near the limit, and suddenly then it gives up. So, yeah, again, as I say, I think there's a bit of work to do there before we can classify them as, and we say this word loosely, McLaren beaters.
Let's get back to the exclusions, particularly the weight thing. So I'm interested to give listeners a bit of an idea of what you do with weight margin. When you're running, say, Jordan 197 or whatever, what sort of margin are you gunning for? Do you set it up as thinking, right, well, if we think everything goes pretty much as we expect, we'll come in 2 kilos over, that's our margin. And then if you're out a little bit, you're within the error bars, so you're safe. How do you go about establishing what the correct margin should be? And does that margin vary according to different circumstances? For example, one of the circumstances that was mentioned here was obviously the tyre wear because of the one stopper, combined with the fact that these are new construction and new compound tyres. They're not so familiar with the C2. That's changed a fair bit. So the wear characteristics of the tyre weren't fully understood, and that played a part. So how do you go about making sure you do have the sensible margin so you don't get on the wrong side of it without just getting to the finish 10 kilos over every time?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a difficult decision to make. I mean, it's the same with a lot of decisions on the car, to be honest. You know, one of our, let's say, just suspension componentry, the wishbones, the loads in the suspensions, you always have a safety factor. And the bigger that safety factor, or the more safety you build into those sort of components, then the heavier the component ends up being. But then you get more miles out of it. So it's chicken and egg. It's one of those sort of things, the same with the fuel load. You know, you have to base your decisions on knowledge. And if you don't have any knowledge of that new tyre and its wear rate, etc., then you have to play safe on it. So, you know, these cars' minimum weight limit's 800 kilograms. So you have to build a safety margin into that, especially if you don't know about the tyres. And what is that safety margin? You know, until you get really down to earth concrete facts, you have to give yourself enough to know that it's going to be, you know, you're going to be safe. And we would have built in something of the region of 3 to 5 kilograms probably as a safety margin, depending upon, you know, how much risk you wanted to take. We were, you know, very seldom were we in the luxury of going into a race and trying to win it from the beginning. So you would always play safe on making sure that you were going to not get thrown out at the end of the race. But still, you know, even no matter what the team is, it would be interesting to average out what the other teams were, what the McLarens were, what the Red Bull was, and what the Mercedes were, just as an average weight, to just see how close to the mark they were. We know George Russell got done for being underweight at Spa when he won the race. So at the end of the day, you know, you don't want to throw away a win or big points just for the fact that you risk 1 kilogram. as I say, maybe you'll be a tenth or a tenth and a half slower per lap as such. But in the race, it all falls into that grey area, as I say, where the driver, just making a couple of little mistakes, that all gets washed into that area. So I'd rather be a tenth and a half slower per lap because I was carrying 5 kilograms extra to the potential weight of the car than run the risk of getting thrown out at the end of the race. So as I say, it's the second race of the season. So until you get yourself a fairly good database as to what the tyres are going to be like as far as durability is concerned, as far as wear rate is concerned, as far as strategy is concerned, because the hard tyre caught them all by surprise, really, how well it lasted as far as performance was concerned. So you've got to give yourself time to do that, and getting thrown out of a race 2 of the season is never a good position to be in.
I'm going to throw in a listener question. Normally we do those in the final part, but this is pertinent to this one. Question from Parker Brown, who asks if the disqualifications from the race are more due to the resurfacing of the track and only having one practice session, or are the teams pushing the limits due to how close the grid is? Should we expect more of this season? And we should note it wasn't just Ferrari who was excluded, because Pierre Gasly in the Alpine was also thrown out for being underweight.
Yeah, it's a good question, Parker. It's a bit of a combination of everything, to be honest. I don't think it's really a case of the resurfacing causing somebody to push the limits. Of course, if the track's smooth, then you will try to run the car lower than as low as possible, which you do at all tracks. And I mean, the time spent with the car dragging its backside on the ground will be wear rate on the plank, but you've got to accommodate all that. So you can't push the limits more than the regulations allow you to. So it's a fine line, As I say, if your car's built, designed, and basically works with the ride height too low, then it doesn't work. You have to make sure that you accommodate the fact that you've got to make run the car in a condition that will allow the plank not to wear itself out. So you have to accommodate these things, and that's about looking at the car. If you keep on lowering the car in the wind tunnel, for example, and the downforce just keeps increasing, then you're going down a blind alley. You've just got to be careful, because you have to stop somewhere. So it's one of these big decisions. If you raise the car, we lose downforce. If we lower the car, we gain downforce. So where do you stop at? I think it's just something that really you've got to address and work within the windows that you're allowed to work within. And that's weight and plank wear. Both of those need to be addressed, because the regulations are pretty black and white on it.
Yeah, and certainly a pretty embarrassing and disappointing blunder from Ferrari, and a very disappointing start to the season overall.
Well, especially after winning the sprint race in a fairly dominant pace, I mean, it was won. It was genuinely won, because, Lewis did get away at the beginning, and he then got caught a little bit mid-race, but then he just got on with it, and away he went again. So, at the end of the day, it's from that on a Saturday to what happened on a Sunday is you can't really. There's no excuses for that.
A reason to buy jewelry? You don't need one. Gift yourself the modern classic piece you've always had your eye on at BlueNile.com. Blue Nile's collection of high-quality diamond jewelry is ready to complement your every look. Show off your elegant taste with a pair of diamond studs, or serve up brilliant style in a traditional tennis bracelet, shipped right to your door. Reward yourself with a piece you've always wanted at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com.
Right, we've talked about Ferrari, but McLaren has been the dominant force so far this season. Very, very interesting performance profile, if you like. They were very dominant in Melbourne, although the conditions in the race meant it was a slightly closer run thing than it would have been on pure pace. And then China, they had a slightly smaller advantage, but actually it seemed bigger almost because they were so unthreatened in the race. So where do you think McLaren are? They characterise it as, yes, we have got the strongest car, but it's not kind of comfortable, easy, dominant. Lando Norris has called the car feisty. They're a bit worried about how it'll be in the windy conditions in Bahrain potentially. So how do you read it?
Yeah, I mean, with any car, you're to do the job and to win races and to be in pole position, you're putting it on its limit, because that's what the limiting factor is, the car's limit. Obviously, as well as that, the driver's limit. So I don't think it's easy for McLaren to get that one lap out of it, because that's whenever you're really, really pushing the car to a limit. But what I was saying there about, the Ferrari earlier, what with the McLaren, you seem to be able to get into a good rhythm. The drivers both seem to be able to get into a good rhythm. And, let's not, corner ourselves. Australia, they would have finished 1-2 and dominated it. And in China, they actually finished 1-2. So at the end of the day, the margin of win is down to how you have to drive the car within that rhythm. In other words, not overloading the tyres, not doing anything stupid with the car, not, minimizing your risk level all the time. And obviously, when it's wet, like in Australia, the drivers can feel the car a lot better. The car's always moving, no matter whether it's dry or wet. But in the wet, you can feel the car at a lot lower pace. So in China, the corner speed's much higher because it's dry, as well as the track characteristics. So you have to, just get your rhythm going and then keep that rhythm and make sure you don't overdo it and not make mistakes. So I think the McLaren is a better car at racing. As far as when you can when the drivers can get into the rhythm of driving it, as opposed to maybe one lap qualifying, and really and truthfully, that's when the points are handed out. It's a race. Yes, it looks like qualifying is critically important, as it always has been, and being at the front is a better place to be for sure than being stuck in the mid pack and having mistakes happen or somebody else taking you out. But I think McLaren have got a reasonable compromise between the two. I think qualifying will always be a little bit tricky. But I think, as I say, they've got a car that the drivers can get into the rhythm quite nicely in a race, wet or dry. And, that's what you want really to get the points. Both of the drivers have just got to accept the fact that it won't always be like Australia or China. There will be races when they won't be able to just go out and win it. And I suppose the sprint race is a bit like that. They both got caught in traffic and, they suffer the consequences of that. And the sprint race is so short with no pit stops. You can't dig yourself out of that whole strategy. So, but sometimes during the season, they'll have to accept that, maybe second or third is okay. But they're off to a very good start.
Interestingly, they talked about the need to be innovative with this car and try and push on with some changes for 25 in order to raise the performance ceiling. They've talked about how the car's a little bit tricky to drive, maybe a little bit of rear-end instability, maybe a little bit of wind sensitivity. Is all of that just the consequence of the fact this is the last year of the regulations and you've really got to be pushing that window as hard as you can to get any extra performance out of it? Because ultimately, it's like anything in Formula One, isn't it? You're running it right on the limit of kind of failure, aren't you? And aerodynamic failure is a stall. So you want to push everything as much as you can. And sometimes a quick car will be that little bit closer to things going over the edge than other ones. And you have to kind of accept that's the price of the performance.
I don't think there's a driver on the grid or a car on the grid that you wouldn't say the same thing to. Everybody is driving the cars to the maximum that will come out of that car. The downforce levels or the balance of the car or the consistency of the cars are all very, very different. But what I'm really sort of saying about the McLaren is the fact that it's when they get into that rhythm for a race, they have made their car work, I suppose, or they've looked at their car in conjunction with the 4 black bits of rubber that keep it off the ground. And that's vitally important. And I think, as I say, it's all right trying to get the best out of those 4 bits of rubber in one lap. That's quite different from trying to get the best out of those 4 bits of rubber for 20 or 30 laps. And I think that's the area that McLaren have probably looked at to try to get the consistency for the pace that you're driving at in race conditions, for the effort level you're putting into it. Because, we see immediately from qualifying to the first laps of the race, we see 6 and 7 seconds of difference. And that's not all fuel load. That's just the fact of your your battery pack's never as good as it would be in one-off lap qualifying. You're never using the whole thing, because if you do use the whole thing, you've got nothing left for the next lap, etc., etc. So there's a lot of compromises built into driving a race. And as Jackie Stewart always used to say, the slower you can win a race, the better, because you're looking after everything. And again, that's the same deal. The tyres are just part of that package, and I think you just have to drive within that. Now, everybody will complain if it's windy. They'll complain if it's hotter than it was before or colder than it was before. There'll always be a reason. But I think one thing McLaren have done since their exploits, I suppose, with the Honda engine, whenever I was I was fairly critical of their not accepting their situation. I think they have got a mentality now where they do accept their situation, and they look at it pretty deeply, because they know that, as a group of people, they're the ones that control their own destiny. What the others do, they have no idea about, but they can control their own destiny. So you need to look at yourself, and you need to always look and see if you can do better tomorrow than you did yesterday. And I think that McLaren have learned that lesson through the Honda episode with them, and then on to Renault, as they did. And they've really dug deep, and I think that they're very, very good at looking at themselves and making sure that they try to improve themselves, as opposed to looking at everybody else and wondering what they're doing or why they're doing it, because, you can't do anything about that. You have to just look at yourself and try and improve yourself.
Shall we talk about Red Bull?
Yes.
There's a lot to talk about with Red Bull. There's all the driver nonsense going on. There's the fact the car isn't quite where it should be. Now, Max Verstappen has been trying to be quite positive. He hasn't gone all 2024 in criticisms of the car, but he does say it's not where he wants it to be, and it's very, very clear from watching it that it's not been where he's wanted it to be right from the start of testing. So it's very difficult to know where to start, but I guess the trickiness of the car, the brilliance that Verstappen's showing by extracting the most from it, and the struggles of Liam Lawson, which have been pretty dismal, it all comes back to the same foundation point, doesn't it, ultimately, if things aren't quite working technically there?
Yeah, it does really. I mean, I think what you say is that Max has been pulling exceptional results out of something that's really not there. And again, it's why it's not there, to be honest. It's a difficult thing for Red Bull. Again, I don't think over the last couple of years, and I'd have to say since the loss of Adrian, I don't think, that's Adrian Newey, I don't think they have been looking at themselves as much as they've been looking at others. And this is where I'm saying McLaren have benefited, because all they've done is try to understand the car themselves better, their own car, and try to exploit more from it in whatever way they can. I think Red Bull, we could say that 2024 and 2025 so far, and even the end of 2023, was relatively dismal as far as the potential of the car was concerned. We need to look, last year I think it was they won the first 7 races. So there's nothing wrong with the start of last year, but then it went away. And when it went away, they didn't ever get it back again. There was the odd glimmer of hope here and there, but it never really came back again. And that's carried on into 2025. So I think that they as a team, they need to sort of start looking at things a little bit more carefully. Now, is Liam Lawson a good reference point as let's say a normal driver, because there's exceptional drivers out there, and I think Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, they're all pretty exceptional drivers, and there's more. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's other drivers out there that aren't exceptional, but I think you've got to classify Liam Lawson as a good racing driver, and he hasn't lost his talent overnight. He was able to be competitive in the what we call the RB2s now, last year. And, he was competitive in there with Tsunoda. Now, have RB2 made a big step? Because Tsunoda and Hadjar are now, mixing it in qualifying whenever it comes to one lap specials. They're mixing it with the big boys. And they seem to fall apart in the race because of some strange strategy calls. But the big question would be, for me, the big question would be, what would Max Verstappen do in an RB2? Because if that's real, and they can balance the RB2 to suit Max's requirements, then it just might be the right thing to do because, all things being equal, a quick car is a quick car. So I think there's reason to believe that, Red Bull have lost their technical way for lots and lots of reasons, probably. A lot of people have moved on to other teams. Some of those other teams are being successful because of that. Some of them not so successful, but they don't seem to have regrouped with the people they've got. So it's going to be a tough year for Red Bull at the moment. There's apparently big talks this week in Milton Keynes about what they do next. But if you've left it to the first 2 races before you realise that what you've done for your 2025 car isn't what you needed from it, you're not going to rectify it in the next 3 months, really. You can't just sort of wipe the slate clean and say, okay, well, we were British but we'll just do this and it'll fix everything. It doesn't do that. And, Mercedes have been an example of that since these regulations came in, since 2022. They've been the team that's been fighting to get up there. Once you lose your way with it, it seems to be pretty difficult to refocus and get yourself going again. Now, Mercedes are a bit better this year than they were last year. But it's one of those sort of situations where it's not an overnight decision to change direction and get the parts on the car that will make the car fast again.
And on the driver question with Liam Lawson, now obviously you had experience of chopping and changing drivers, but that was usually forced. That will have been other factors, not just deciding the driver you've got is rubbish and you want to replace them. But a few months ago, Red Bull decided that Lawson was their best option, that he was mentally robust, that he had a similar driving style. Now, no one would say that Australia and China were anything other than terrible weekends given what the car could do. But it seems to me extraordinary that you can pick a driver and then after 2 race weekends be seriously thinking that they've proven everything you thought about them wrong, because that just shows that you weren't on firm ground. I just really, really struggled to understand all this. I know a lot of the stuff was going on. It was almost the least worst option, but it seems to me almost like I don't know what they were expecting to happen ultimately, because he was always going to struggle to a greater or lesser degree, wasn't he? So you surely, if you're a technical director or a team principal or whatever, you've got to surely check yourself at this point and say, hang on a minute, this is just a ridiculous situation to be in.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is that the management there are playing with somebody's career, basically his life. Liam Lawson and his family have put everything into to get to where he is now. And, he held his head reasonably high in the RB2 last year. And when he got the opportunities to get into the car, he never had the flow of it all, I don't think, to just, settle down and know he was there for a season. So, I think he's always been looked at. But as I say, Red Bull should have the data to look at how he drives the car. They should have, a much, much more in-depth understanding than we have from the outside. And I agree with you. If they made the decision to put them in for the season, it had to be based on something. And that hasn't changed over 2 weeks. It just hasn't. So at the end of the day, I think all this is either a big smoke screen or pressure from some other direction that, because we do have this Christian Horner Helmut Marko feud that always goes on between what one says and what the other one says. So we're never quite sure what's down at the bottom of it. But it would, if they were adding to Lawson's sort of inability to settle down, then they're doing the wrong thing. Nobody likes criticism. And if you're getting criticism from your 2 bosses as such, and you're getting questioned from your 2 bosses, the chances of you getting, clear in your head and just getting on with it is pretty remote. I said in my article that we wrote in the magazine and the website was, they just need to sit down with the guy now. He's had 2 race weekends that have been terrible. Red Bull haven't exactly shone as the Red Bull used to. So they need to sit down with it and say, right, okay, look, this is what Max is doing. This is what you're doing. Does that what suits you? What do you need to do? Where do we need to go with this thing for you? Not for Max, but for you. And they need to put some effort into that. And as I say, going to these next 3 races, it's a triple header. I would make sure that he knows the situation, that success is what it's all about. he has to up his game, but he has to up his game with their backing. Get in the simulator, understand what's going on a bit better. And then, even at that point in time, question the simulator, because obviously, something has taken them in this direction. But we never, we have to take Bahrain testing, Australia and China. We never really saw one lap where you thought, right, okay, it's just bad luck that's happening here to Lawson. It just nothing happened. It just was a non-event for the three events, the testing and the 2 race weekends. So they need to look quite deeply at what's happening there and why it's happening there, because it's not just the driver's lost his talent overnight.
Well, we talked about 3 of the big 4 teams, so let's complete the set by quickly addressing Mercedes. They're quite interesting because the Mercedes clearly isn't really quick enough, but it seems to be probably the most consistent car. It looks pretty good on track. It's probably the one that looks second best to the Mercedes. Does that bode well that they've got a car that's working nicely and they can build on it, or is it maybe a car that's perhaps a little bit too benign?
Well, it's, as you say there, second best to McLaren. I think, that's the thing you got to do, is get yourself a car that, as I say, I keep on talking this rhythm, that the drivers can get into a rhythm in. It does look like the Mercedes, George Russell, well, both drivers, but George Russell especially, is able to dig a lap out of it. Sometimes it's even a little bit of a surprise to themselves, I think. You have to stay that still. So I think if I was to take Ferrari and Mercedes, it's still got a question mark over them as to how they're going to perform at each weekend, because it just, there isn't sort of a black and white, this is where we are. And I think, again, George has got now a lot of experience. It's wrong to think of him as a young kid in the block, same as Lando Norris, really, to be honest. They're both in the same sort of area of experience. So I think, he does drive it well and he does understand it very well. But I do still think there's a little bit of a question mark over how they're going to do each weekend, even within Mercedes themselves, not really sort of knowing completely how the car's going to perform. I think they've been sort of caught up in this cooler weather, hotter weather stuff, and they're still questioning themselves as far as that's concerned. So I think with any of those top teams, Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, and even, as I say, McLaren, we need to see a few more races before we really get a picture as to who's just not quite got the car sorted out yet, or who's potentially, going to challenge the might of McLaren at the moment. Because you have to say, McLaren finished the season strongly last year and they started the season strongly this year. So the chances of anybody just turning it around from pure setup is minimal. I think it'll take more than that. And we also get all this, this stuff that the FIA is throwing in about flexing wings and mini DRSs and, flexing front wings, flexing rear wings. And then we've got Barcelona coming, which is a change in that package to look at as well. So it's going to be, who can keep their head up during the season, I think, who can develop the best, and also who can adapt their cars to suit the Barcelona changes. It's going to be an interesting one to see who gets out of this sort of quagmire, I suppose, of regulation changes mid-season. It's going to affect everybody, I'm sure, one way or another.
And the good thing is it gives us lots to talk about here on the Tech Podcast. Well, as always, we'll dedicate the final part of the podcast to questions from listeners. We always appreciate the questions you send in. If you've got something you'd like answered about the technical side of Formula One, whether it's past or present, doesn't have to necessarily be relevant to what's going on exactly now, but it also can be. Send it through to podcast@therace.com. That's podcast@therace.com, and we will endeavour to answer it on a future episode. We've got 3 more questions today on top of the one that we addressed in the first section about Ferrari. The first comes from Hannah Kerrigan. The Haas bodywork falling off in testing opened my eyes to the complexity of the aerodynamics going on beneath the surface of the car, which I hadn't appreciated before. How has the engineering of this air changed over time? For example, was this subsurface airflow a high priority on the Jordan 191? Is Flovis applied on areas beneath the skin? I'm very curious. It's a whole hidden world, isn't there, Gary? It's a great question.
Yes, there's there is bodywork within the bodywork, and that's basically made these cars lately into much better aerodynamically understood vehicles. I'd like to say the Jordan 191 did have a lot of delicate bodywork underneath the surface, but I think that's probably exaggerating it a little bit. I mean, you normally would have a radiator intake duct that takes you from the inlet as such up into the radiator. And then after that, it's, all's fair in love and war. The airflow gets out of there somehow. So the making sure that the airflow inside the bodywork is optimal is critically important, because it allows you to then minimize the flow, the cooling, the radiator core size. And that's one thing that CFD is very good at, being able to model a duct. It's got 4 sides on it. It's got corner connections, etc., etc. So modeling all of that and the radiator blockage, which you know pretty well, so that you get an inlet, a radiator blockage, and flow to that radiator. That means that you're using the full radiator core to the best possible. It's not always just about connecting one thing up to the other. It's about how you expand the flow on the way to it, because the inlet area, let's say, as a rough thing, would be sort of 20 to 25% of the area of the radiator core that it's feeding. So you've got to make sure that flow can get through that hole. First of all, it's decent flow coming off the trailing edge of the front wing, but then the flow can get through that inlet and then expand in that duct fairly uniformly, so that the radiator core itself, the complete radiator core, is used for cooling. And then again, after that, you try to manage it getting around all the other stuff that's behind it, as opposed to just leaving a big open hole there. Because again, the more efficient you can make the bodywork inside the bodywork, the radiator feeding bodywork as such, then the less airflow you need to cool the car, and the more airflow you have to use around the outside of the car to optimize the downforce levels. Going back in time, I remember Patrick Head in 1998 standing on the grid. I think it was Imola, and Jeff Willis was their technical director at the time, and Patrick was always fairly loud on the grid, but he was shouting at Jeff Willis, "Jeff, underflow bodywork, underflow airflow, that's what was screwed up in this car, because the car wasn't as good as the car was in 1997. Underbody airflow," he said. We've got to focus on underbody airflow to make the car go faster. And it was just one of those decisions that Patrick made on the grid at I think it was Imola, as I say. Very interesting, because it's, when you realise something like this suddenly way back then it's something that you really do pursue. But as I say, the body profiles inside, the radiator ducts, the expansion rate, all that, etc., working together with the radiator cores is actually very important to the downforce that the external bodywork can create.
And presumably your CFD work is critical to being able to understand and optimise that.
Well, as I say, the one thing that's good about CFD is the fact of a closed duct to optimise that flow, because you know the flow velocity of the air going into the duct, into the leading, into the radiator entry, and then you know the area and blockage of the radiator core that you're trying to put into the car, and the size of the radiator core sort of comes from the heat rejection of the engine, and then you've got to make sure that radiator core is working over the maximum of its area. If you got any corners, areas where you're getting airflow separation, then the radiator core, you can make it 10 times the size and it won't cool any better. So you need to make sure that what you've got is working efficiently, and CFD is very, very good for doing that, because, as I say, it's a closed duct, so you've just got an intake velocity, a blockage, and an area of radiator, and you go from one size to the other and expand it as uniformly as you can to make sure you get no separation points, separation bubbles, because you have a little separation on the inside of a duct. It's tiny, the size of your thumbnail as such, but before you know it, it's the size of your fist. So it's about the small detail about trying to tidy up all these separation areas, airflow separation, and as I say, CFD is ideal for that.
The next question comes from David Teague from Holly Springs, North Carolina, USA. In the first podcast of the season, you mentioned the slot gap in the front wing was to get more air to the underfloor. was the front wing that Mercedes started the season with last year, with the wire upper element near the nose, an extreme way to try and accomplish that? We should note that although it was characterised as a wire upper element, that was a carbon fibre strip that they had on that wing. Yeah, you can get carbon fibre wire nowadays even, but it's David. It's one of those sort of situations, as I say, where if you take a slice through the car on car centre line, you'll see that the nose itself curves up quite dramatically and joins up to the front of the chassis at the sort of front bulkhead area. The front bulkhead is defined in the regulations as far as its size is concerned and its positioning, its height. So everybody's front bulkhead is more or less in the same place. But it's about getting that airflow to stay attached to the underneath of the nose, because it's that section at the centre of the car that is putting the airflow in between the two inner splitters, I think you call them, on the underfloor. The two splitters that are nearest to the centre line of the car. The airflow that goes through there is what will feed the underfloor and turn the diffuser. So the diffuser is pulling that airflow through underneath the car through that gap between those two splitters. Now, if you had the whole front of the underfloor open to the airflow that's there, you would end up with the diffuser isn't big enough to speed that airflow up to generate any downforce. So you've got these three splitters each side, turning vanes, I suppose you might call them, vertical turning vanes in the underfloor, and you're trying to turn as much airflow as you can out the side of the car, at the front corner. So the central section of the floor and that slot gap that we have between the nose and the forward element is an area where you can run yourself into trouble if you don't have decent flow through there. And you're trying to turn the airflow. If you don't get decent flow through there, then you're trying to turn the airflow that's going down the sides of the nose, turn it round that sort of corner underneath the nose and into between the two splitters, the two inner splitters on the underfloor. And that's where sort of Mercedes what they were trying to do was minimise that intersection of the front wing to allow more flow, basically, to get to the centre line of the car. So I think that, it's one of those sort of situations. You set out to achieve something, you'll find a solution that makes things work better. But is that the real solution, or is it just a sort of bandage on it at the time because what you've got isn't great? That's what development's all about, trying to find the steps of improvement. But, at the end of the day, every time you make a step of improvement, you make a step in understanding. And then there might be other ways of making a bigger step in improvement. And at that flow area, as far as I'm concerned, around down the sides of the nose and through the slot gap that I keep on harping about, between the nose and the forward element, that's flow that the diffuser, that's good high energy flow that the diffuser wants to work on. And you've got to be sympathetic to that. So if you're not sympathetic to that, the car will still work, but it will work differently, and it will not work the same whenever the car's, the ride height's changing dramatically on these cars. And we always hear about the car porpoising, or the car hitting the ground, or the car bouncing, or the car not generating the downforce unless you run it lower. So it all starts at the front. The first thing that happens to the airflow, you have to live with all the way through the car. And you need to be as sympathetic as possible to the flow through there. Now, if we went back in the regulations and said the nose height can be any height you want it, there wouldn't be a nose down on top of the front wing like we currently have. It'd all be separated by those great big pylons and stuff again to allow airflow to the centre line of the car. So, don't forget everything you've learned as far as I'm concerned. There is a reason for that all happening, and I think that slot gap between the nose and the front wing forward element is just as critical now as it has been for donkey's years. Let's get on to the final question now, which comes from Brian Stryker from Chicago. With adding downforce being such a focus of F1 cars, why is it optimal to deliberately take downforce off at higher speed tracks with a low downforce rear wing? Is there something inherent about a rear wing that adds drag compared to finding downforce on the underfloor, for example? Or is wing downforce less useful in some way than getting downforce from other areas of the car, like the diffuser?
No, it's one of these sort of chicken and egg. The thing about it is taking downforce off at high-speed tracks, Brian, it's you want to get rid of the drag. You don't actually want to get rid of the downforce, but you want to get rid of the drag. And the only way you can get rid of the drag is to reduce the downforce. The downforce and drag of these cars is probably ends up around something like 4-to-1 ratio. So in other words, you get 4 times the downforce from the total car. This is for 400 kilograms of downforce, you might get 100 kilograms of drag. The underfloor itself is it's about 10-to-1. So in other words, you get 100 kilograms of downforce from the underfloor for 1 kilogram of drag. And the rear wing is probably like 3.5. So you get 3.5 kilograms of downforce for 1 kilogram of drag. So what you do for high-speed tracks is search around the car and find the least efficient part that's there to reduce the drag and minimise the loss of downforce. The biggest drag factors on these cars is the 4 tyres, but you can't do much about them. So the first thing you hit upon is the least efficient part of the car, which is the rear wing. You reduce that, then you need to get the car balanced, so then the front wing gets a bit of treatment. The front wing itself is not a big drag component in these cars. It's actually a flow component. It affects the whole car behind itself. So the front wing is something that you don't want to be meddling with too much if you can help it, because you set the whole rest of the car all up to aerodynamically work efficiently with the flow that's coming off that front wing. And if you keep changing the front wing, you end up with a different flow characteristic. So it's all a sort of circle of events. As I say, for Monza, you would love to run Monaco wing levels, but you can't because of the drag, and the car will be just very slow down the straight. The other thing to add here is that as far as stability is concerned under braking, the rear wing is much better than the underfloor. And it's one of these reasons, it's one of these things where the cars have become unstable under braking more now, because you're producing 75% of the downforce from the underfloor and 25% of the downforce from the wings. So it's like having a parachute behind you. The rear wing, and even if it's got a bit more drag on it, acts a bit like a parachute behind you when you hit the brake pedal, whereas the underfloor doesn't act like a parachute behind you. It doesn't sort of stabilise the car. It gives you grip. It gives you tire grip for sure, but it doesn't stabilise the car. It doesn't sort of hold you from behind like a parachute would, if you can imagine. So it's a big compromise between what's good downforce and drag from the rear wing. And that's why you see, a gurney flap, for example, because it's right at the extreme of the rear wing, is actually quite a good thing for rear end stability under braking. So it's one of those things, if you could run a little bit less wing angle, but with a gurney flap on it that equals the same sort of downforce load, the car will feel more stable when you're braking. So it's all about, a lot of these things are about some experience as well as just black and white numbers at the bottom of a spreadsheet. But it all sort of gets put together in the jigsaw puzzle that is a Formula 1 car. And that's what the compromises are for any team. Find the right solution for certain things and then exploit them a little bit further.
Well, thanks very much for those 3 great questions and also the excellent answers from Gary. As I said, if you've got a question, send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcast@the-race.com. And we'll endeavour to get onto them in a future episode. But in the meantime, thanks very much, Gary, for your time. We're going to turn our attentions to the build-up to the next series of races. We've got a triple header coming up, so we'll get loads more data out of those, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of big technical talking points for us to get into. So join us after the Japanese Grand Prix for more from Gary.
The Athletic.